The history of this gun, which later became one of the most recognizable symbols of artillery power in the Second World War, begins long before the first crew issued the command to fire. To understand why this particular weapon attained near mythical status, one must return to the 1920s, an era when Germany, bound by the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, sought to rebuild and rethink its military doctrine under conditions of covert development, diplomatic constraints, and clandestine cooperation with foreign states. Following the end of the First World War, Germany found itself in a position where its armed forces were subjected to severe disarmament. Artillery, particularly large-caliber pieces, fell under strict prohibitions. However, military engineers, primarily specialists from the Krupp and Rheinmetall firms, did not abandon the idea of creating a new, powerful weapon capable of operating at high altitudes and countering the rapidly evolving threat of aviation. It was in this context that the concept of the future 88mm anti-aircraft gun, the flak, emerged as a versatile means of air defense that would later become legendary. The development of German aviation in the 1920s, often conducted through flying clubs and civilian schools, necessitated the creation of a new generation air defense system. However, it was not only aircraft that shaped the requirements for the future gun. Germany closely studied the experiences of the First World War, where the use of artillery against ground attack bombers had demonstrated the low effectiveness of older systems. The primary issue was insufficient muzzle velocity, which limited the horizons of application against aerial targets. In response, Krupp engineers proposed a concept for a gun with very high muzzle velocity and the capability to fire at extreme altitudes, a parameter that defined the future 88mm Flak 18. Before the gun became a reality, Germany faced the need to conceal its development from Entente inspectors. This is why some early trials and design work were conducted outside the country, in the Soviet Union, at a secret testing ground near Kazan. There, under joint German-Soviet projects, the first prototypes were tested, laying the foundations for the future masterpiece. Although official documents from those years have not been fully preserved, it is known that it was there that engineers had the opportunity to refine technological solutions that would have been impossible to implement within Germany itself. Beginning in 1931, as the political climate gradually shifted and Germany could more actively pursue rearmament, the 88mm gun project entered its final phase. In 1933, the National Socialist regime came to power, making the militarization of the country one of the pillars of its policy. Within months, massive investments flooded into the armed forces, and work on the new anti-aircraft gun received unprecedented priority. It was during this period that a qualitative leap occurred. The Flak 18 acquired its final configuration, a long barrel of 56 calibers, a complex but effective carriage system, and powerful ballistics that allowed firing at both aerial and ground targets. One of the key engineering decisions was the combination of high muzzle velocity, over 800 meters per second, and highly precise barrel mechanics. While many countries focused on lighter guns with less power, German engineers chose the opposite path, to create a gun capable of penetrating any existing armor at the time, even though this was not part of the original task. Notably, the anti-tank role of the future 88, as the Germans called the 88mm gun, emerged not in design bureaus, but on the fields of Spain during the Civil War of 1936 to 1939. The Spanish conflict became the Flak 18's baptism of fire. Although the Germans deployed the gun as an air defense asset and used it with units of the Condor Legion, it quickly became apparent that its immense power allowed it to destroy tanks, fortifications, barricades, and even buildings with remarkable effectiveness. Crews often faced shortages of anti-tank weapons, and the flak became a tool capable of altering the course of local battles. Episodes of its use near Madrid and on other sectors of the front generated deep interest within the Wehrmacht. It turned out that this heavy and cumbersome anti-aircraft gun could serve as a universal instrument of destruction. Even more importantly, Spain revealed the shortcomings of the early model. The Flak 18's carriage proved heavy and inconvenient for relocation. The cooling system required refinement, and the crew of 11 was excessive by the standards of rapidly changing battles. All this led to the creation of the Flak 36 modification, followed by the Flak 37, improved versions that optimized the design, allowed faster repositioning, and provided more accurate aiming. By 1939, at the outset of the Second World War, the 88mm gun was no longer just a weapon. It had become part of German military doctrine. The Wehrmacht planned to use it as the backbone of the air defense system, but also as a means of breaching fortifications. Engineers, officers, and political leadership viewed the Flak 88 as the embodiment of Germany's technical superiority, and not without reason. Soon, this image would be confirmed on the fields of Poland, France, and North Africa, where the 88mm gun first demonstrated its true power in full-scale warfare. Before the 88 became the nightmare of British tank crews, a weapon of strategic importance and a symbol of German engineering prowess, one must understand what its first combat crews were like. These were people, often having undergone accelerated training, dealing with a high-tech gun that demanded coordination, precision, and discipline. The Flak 88 was not just a gun, it was an entire system, almost a living machine requiring near mathematical accuracy in operation. And it was precisely the people servicing it who transformed this technical tool into a formidable weapon. When German forces crossed the Polish border in September 1939, the 88mm flak was already regarded as one of the most modern elements of air defense. However, events quickly showed that its role extended far beyond combating aviation. The Polish campaign became the threshold where the 88 first revealed its potential as a versatile weapon, and it was here that its reputation began to form as a gun capable of destroying anything in its path. Poland, like many European armies of the time, was equipped with tanks featuring relatively thin armor. Most German anti-tank weapons, primarily the 37mm Paquet 36, proved sufficient against these machines. Nevertheless, in the first weeks of the war, commanders of artillery units discovered that the Flak 88, when engaging ground targets, demonstrated results exceeding expectations. Its immense muzzle velocity, flat trajectory, and significant fragmentation effect turned the gun into a means of suppressing any fortified positions. Permanent firing points, old forts, and brick buildings converted into improvised strongholds were literally shattered by the heavy shells. Although the Polish campaign did not become the place where the 88mm gun gained fame, it marked the first stage in transforming the flak into the Swiss Army knife of the German forces. True recognition of its versatility came in France in 1940. It was there that the 88mm flak first proved itself as a formidable anti-tank weapon. While the armor of French heavy tanks like the B-1 Biaz and British Matildas seemed virtually impervious to most German anti-tank guns, the Flak 88 became the only weapon capable of engaging them at significant distances. In a well-known episode, one flak crew destroyed several such machines that completely ignored hits from light anti-tank shells. This made a strong impression on the command staff, who until then had perceived the 88mm gun as a specialized air defense asset. The French campaign forced the Wehrmacht to reconsider its approach to heavy anti-aircraft artillery. It became clear that the Flak 88 could serve as a pivotal asset in any conflict where the enemy employed armored vehicles or fortifications. However, in Europe, there was one limitation. The dense forested and urban landscape hindered long-range application of the gun. Nevertheless, it was here that the practice of using the flak as a direct support gun first emerged, with it being rolled out to the front lines to literally blast a path for infantry and tanks. The true realization of the Flak 88's potential occurred in North Africa. When General Erwin Rommel arrived on the continent in February 1941, he quickly realized that the open desert was the ideal theater for a weapon of this class. Unlike Europe, there were no forests or cities to restrict firing range, and the Flak 88 could operate at maximum distances, becoming a tool of superiority. It became not only a means of destroying British tanks, but also part of the tactical doctrine that allowed the Desert Fox to achieve victories that seemed impossible. Rommel employed the Flak 88 so effectively that the gun became almost a symbol of the Afrika Korps. One of the most famous tactics involved placing the flak in pre-prepared positions under camouflage. German tanks acted as bait, retreating under the pressure of British armored formations. When the enemy entered the pre-calculated kill zone, the camouflage was dropped, and the Flak 88 opened fire. The gun's power was so great that it penetrated British Matilda 2 tanks at distances where they simply could not respond. In one such episode, near Sidi Rezeg, an Afrika Korps unit destroyed dozens of British vehicles in just a few minutes. For the Allies, that day was a shock. The tactic of deep defense built around the Flak 88 shattered the very concept of tank offensives. Reports from British commanders began to include lines about the enemy using large-caliber anti-aircraft guns as anti-tank weapons, and they were devastating. Soon, the Flak 88 came to be seen by the Allies as a primary target for neutralization on the battlefield. British and Australian units reported cases where a single well-camouflaged gun could halt the advance of an entire column. In North Africa, where visibility was ideal and distances vast, each flak became almost an artillery sniper. Yet such effective use came at a cost. German flak crews became priority targets for enemy artillery. On the flat desert surface, it was difficult to conceal muzzle flashes, and the gun's design, tall, conspicuous, mounted on a massive carriage, made it an ideal target for Allied long-range guns. To compensate, German crews began employing complex camouflage systems, digging deep firing pits, and creating decoy positions to divert enemy shells. Parallel to combat use, modernization continued. In Africa, the Flak 36 and Flak 37 versions were actively employed. They featured a collapsible carriage, simplified transport, and most importantly, an improved aiming system. For operations in desert conditions, this was critically important. High temperatures, sand, and constant vibrations destroyed mechanisms, and the gun required regular maintenance. Despite this, crews noted the flak's remarkable reliability. Even when sand infiltrated the loading mechanisms or lubricant thickened under the scorching sun, the gun remained operational. The Allies quickly realized that the Flak 88 was not just another gun. It was a strategic factor. It could halt tank offensives, destroy fortifications, suppress artillery, and even engage aerial targets if the situation demanded. This made it not only a versatile weapon, but one of the most dangerous tools in the hands of German forces. Yet there was one aspect often overlooked in discussions. Despite all its power, the Flak 88 required high crew proficiency. Working with this gun was not simple. Officers noted that only well-trained, disciplined soldiers could unlock its potential. This was not a gun that could simply be thrown onto the battlefield. It was a system demanding mathematics, coordination, skills, and composure. In North Africa, the Flak 88's effectiveness became legendary, but it also exposed its vulnerabilities. Weight, visibility, and dependence on prepared positions made each gun a valuable but vulnerable resource. The loss of one flak was felt as the loss of a key element in the entire battle line. However, despite the difficulties and dangers, it was here, in the deserts of Libya, that the 88 finally shaped its reputation. It became a symbol of firepower, precision, and versatility that made it unique among the artillery of its time. But ahead lay the Eastern Front, a place where the fate of the Flak 88 would become not just important, but decisive, with trials surpassing everything seen in Africa and Western Europe. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, German forces entered a world that surpassed in scale, brutality, and technical challenges everything they had previously encountered. The Eastern Front became the arena where the 88mm Flak 88 not only continued its career, but found itself at the center of the harshest tests, demonstrating incredible effectiveness while simultaneously revealing the limits of its crews and design. In the first weeks of the invasion, the Flak 88 was used primarily in its traditional role as powerful anti-aircraft artillery, covering columns, crossings, headquarters, and major rear formations. But the situation changed rapidly. On the front, the need arose to combat a new adversary: Soviet heavy tanks, primarily the KV-1 and KV-2, which came as an unpleasant surprise to German troops. Their massive armor, exceeding 75 millimeters in some places, proved virtually impervious to standard German anti-tank guns. Light Paki 36s simply ricocheted, leaving bright marks on the Soviet machine's armor. Even heavier weapons like the 50mm Pak 38 often failed to cope with these armored behemoths. Under these conditions, the Flak 88 became almost the only weapon capable of stopping heavy Soviet tanks. Numerous memoirs of German artillerymen recount how crews hurriedly wheeled 88mm guns into direct fire positions, sometimes under fire, sometimes in open terrain without cover. The fates of individual battalions and entire sectors of the front sometimes depended on whether a flak crew could occupy a position before Soviet tanks breached the defensive line. One of the most notable episodes was the defense in the Dubno-Lutsk-Brody area in June 1941. It was there that German forces encountered heavy KVs that literally crushed forward units. In some cases, German tanks were forced to retreat, leaving flanks exposed. The Flak 88 became the sole means of halting the advance. Witnesses to these events described how 88mm gun shells penetrated KV-1s from distances over a kilometer, and often a single hit was sufficient to disable the vehicle. But behind each such hit lay immense tension. Every second of delay could prove fatal for the crew. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, the Flak 88's role continued to expand. It served as an anti-tank weapon, a means of destroying concrete fortifications, an element of the air defense shield, and even, in isolated cases, an improvised artillery piece for counter-battery fire. But anti-tank use became dominant. On the Eastern Front, German commanders quickly realized that wherever a Flak 88 appeared, it needed to be employed on the front lines. However, this tactic had its downside. If the vast desert in North Africa allowed the Flak 88 to engage at long ranges, conditions in the east were far more complex. Battles often took place in swampy terrain, dense forests, cities, and villages where long-range capability lost its advantage. Moving this heavy gun over muddy roads was a task that sometimes exceeded the crew's strength. The gun weighed several tons, and extracting it from mud required tractors, which were often in short supply. As a result, crews sometimes found themselves stuck in one position, becoming easy targets for enemy artillery or infantry. With the onset of winter in 1941 to 1942, the situation worsened further. Freezing temperatures reaching 30 to 40 degrees below zero made steel brittle, lubricant thickened, and mechanisms froze. Under such conditions, maintaining the flak turned into grueling physical labor. German artillerymen described having to warm mechanisms for extended periods, working with bare hands in the cold to feel the metal, all while under the threat of sudden attack. Despite this, the flak continued to function. The design's reliability shone through. A gun built for high-altitude warfare proved remarkably resilient to the most extreme conditions. In 1942 to 1943, as the war in the East took on a protracted and extremely fierce character, the Flak 88 became part of the defensive lines that held German forces at Stalingrad, Leningrad, Rzhev, and the Kursk Bulge. The gun played a particularly dramatic role during the Stalingrad campaign. In urban street fighting, the 88mm gun was rarely used to full effect, but on the approaches to the city and its outskirts, it became a decisive factor in holding back Soviet offensive wedges. When German forces were encircled, the Flak 88 was used less frequently due to shortages of fuel, tractors, and ammunition. Nevertheless, episodes of its employment remain in the recollections of survivors. The gun was often used to combat assault groups pushing toward Potomnik airfield or supply depots. Sometimes the Flak 88, deployed directly amid building ruins, engaged targets at minimal ranges, functioning almost like an assault gun. For crews, this was an incredibly dangerous situation. Each muzzle flash instantly revealed the position, and in the city, artillery survived for mere seconds. The culmination of the Flak 88's use in the East was the Battle of Kursk. Although legends of mass duels between T-34s and Flak 88s are greatly exaggerated, documents confirm the gun's active employment at several key defensive nodes. Particularly important was the Flak's role in providing anti-assault defense for fortified positions on the southern face of the Bulge. Despite the fact that by 1943, the Wehrmacht had specialized heavy anti-tank weapons like the PK-43 and self-propelled guns, the 88mm Flak remained a critically important element. But it was on the Eastern Front that the Flak 88's limits became apparent. Tanks strengthened their armor, shells improved, and although the 88mm gun retained its fearsome reputation, it was no longer invincible. While in North Africa, British tanks often could not even approach lethal range, in the East Soviet machines operated in masses, more maneuverably with artillery support, and the Flak increasingly came under dense fire. Each new position became a test of survival. Soviet artillerymen quickly learned to recognize tracers, determine the gun's location, and blanket it with fire. By 1944, the Flak 88 remained a powerful but no longer ideal anti-tank weapon. New Soviet tanks like the IS-2 had armor that was not so easy to penetrate at long ranges. Nevertheless, the gun retained its value. It could still destroy any tank upon hitting vulnerable zones, and experienced crews knew how to use terrain, camouflage, and surprise. However, no less important was the flak's psychological significance. Wehrmacht soldiers often said, "If an 8.8 is nearby, we'll hold the line." It was a weapon that instilled confidence. But the same gun was an object of hatred and fear for the enemy. Soviet memoirs describe the Flak 88 as a black thorn that pierced tanks through and through, a armor devourer that could suddenly strike a vehicle at immense distance. In the end, the Flak became a symbol not only of German superiority, but also of German desperation. As the war progressed, 88mm guns were increasingly placed in hopeless positions, attempting to delay the inevitable advance. With each month, it became harder to deliver ammunition, evacuate guns, and find trained crews. Yet the Flak 88 fought to the end, at Warsaw, on the Vistula, on the Oder, and in the suburbs of Berlin. On the Eastern Front, the 88mm Flak traversed the full path from a weapon of triumph, powerful and nearly invincible, to the last hope, a symbol of tenacity and resistance. Here it earned its grim fame, here its strongest attributes were revealed, and here too its limits emerged. Not from the technology, but from the exhaustion of the army, resource shortages, and the fact that the war had become one of attrition. As strategic initiative gradually shifted to the Allies and the skies over Europe increasingly filled with bombers, the 88mm Flak 88 found itself at the center of another front, a front where war was waged not in kilometers, but in altitude, reaction time, and calculation precision. If on the Eastern Front the gun became a universal means of survival, then within the air defense system of the Third Reich, it transformed into an industrial-scale tool, integrated into a complex, multi-layered system that Germany built throughout the war. The first major impetus for air defense development came in 1940, when British aviation began striking German cities and industrial sites. Initially, these raids were limited, but even then, Luftwaffe Command realized that the Flak 88 was a key element of future defensive strategy. By 1942, the situation had changed radically. The Allies transitioned to systematic destruction of German industrial infrastructure. B-17s, B-24s, Avro Lancasters, and Halifaxes conducted raids almost daily, so the need for powerful air defense grew to levels unimaginable at the war's start. German air defense was organized such that the core of the entire system consisted of batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns, most often the Flak 88, along with heavier 105mm and 128mm installations. They were positioned on prepared sites, typically around cities, industrial hubs, airfields, oil refineries, and rail centers. Each battery was part of a larger network where information exchange occurred almost continuously. The principle of this system's operation was based on early detection. Before radars appeared, crews relied on rangefinders, observation posts, acoustic devices, and a network of observers scattered across the country. In the early war, this approach was acceptable, but as speeds and altitudes increased, it quickly became obsolete. The Germans began actively introducing radars like Freya and Würzburg, which allowed determination of bomber groups' altitude, speed, and direction far more accurately than human observers with binoculars. The Flak's task was not simply to open fire. Its role was to create fire density capable of breaking bomber formations, disabling individual aircraft, or at least forcing them to change altitude, deviate from course, or drop bombs prematurely. Unlike anti-tank combat, where the Flak 88 was used selectively, in air defense it operated with enormous ammunition expenditure. By war's end, destroying a single heavy bomber required 12,000 to 20,000 shells, a figure that seems absurd but reflects the reality of aerial warfare. However, as air raids grew more massive, the fire control system needed to be even more precise. It was here that the Flak 88 revealed its technical depth. German engineers created a mechanical computing device known as the commando Gerät, which was essentially an analog computer. It calculated the target's trajectory, predicted its position tens of seconds ahead, and transmitted data via cables to the guns. Crews merely followed instructions that automatically aligned the barrels to the required angles. This combination of technology and human discipline turned a flak battery into a well-organized machine. With visual observation and operator input data on the flight direction and target speed. Radar refined altitude and distance. The command post calculated lead and fuse delay. The cable system transmitted aiming angles and fuse settings to each gun, which was brought to combat readiness. All this occurred in seconds and often determined whether a bomber group would survive or suffer heavy losses. But the system's effectiveness was not solely a technical achievement. It depended on the psychological preparation of crews. Many serving in heavy batteries were not professional military personnel, but mobilized workers, youths from the Hitler Youth, female radar operators, and signalers. Their training was accelerated, but immense concentration was required to maintain high loading rates, fire corrections, and inter-crew coordination. It was especially difficult at night. Night raids by the British RAF forced work in near-total darkness, using only radar data, which significantly increased stress. One of the most destructive periods of the air war was the raids on the Ruhr region. This area was considered Germany's industrial heart, and it was here that flak density reached maximum levels. Around Essen, Duisburg, Dortmund, and other cities, dozens of batteries created multi-layered defenses. But the Allies responded with escalating power. Hundreds of heavy bombers simultaneously entered German airspace, and even dense flak fire could not stop this flow. Flak 88 crews were under fire, not only from the air, but also from the ground. Even if a bomb fell several hundred meters away, the blast wave injured crews, broke structures, and damaged aiming systems. Moreover, the Allies began using cluster bombs specifically designed to destroy anti-aircraft batteries. These munitions exploded at a set altitude and scattered small sub-munitions that targeted crews and equipment. The appearance of such weapons sharply increased losses, especially among young and inexperienced artillerymen. The Flak 88, while powerful, remained vulnerable. Its precise operation required a stable position unaffected by explosions. Its cable lines were easily damaged by debris, and repositioning took considerable time. Each battery loss meant a breach in the defense that the Allies could exploit for deeper strikes. In 1943, the situation complicated further. The Americans began daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British operating at night, American air forces flew in dense formations covered by long-range fighters and struck key targets with high accuracy. This forced the Germans to increase flak density near strategic objectives, simultaneously reducing mobility and flexibility of the system. Despite this, the Flak 88 continued to inflict damage. Even if not downing an aircraft, it could force a pilot to alter course, drop bombs off target, or reduce strike effectiveness. The Allies had to account for zones of dense fire and gradually develop tactics for electronic suppression of German radars. This, in turn, reduced flak fire accuracy and made night raids more destructive. By war's end, Germany's air defense resembled a gigantic system operating at the limits of capacity. Ammunition production and gun repairs occurred around the clock, but even that was insufficient. Flak shell expenditure reached millions per month. The transportation system, already damaged by bombings, failed to deliver the necessary quantities of shells and parts. Batteries often remained with ammunition shortages, and crews with a lack of trained personnel. Yet the Flak 88 remained the primary heavy anti-aircraft gun until the war's end. Its accuracy, reliability, and versatility made it indispensable. It fought over Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, Würzburg, Regensburg, and many other cities attempting to protect their factories and residents from airstrikes that became increasingly inevitable. With the growing intensity of the war, the Flak's role shifted from a defensive measure to a struggle for survival. It could not halt Allied air superiority, but could slow destruction, reduce losses, and at least partially protect what remained. For crews, this was a daily routine, waiting for the siren, occupying positions, receiving data, opening fire, trying to work faster than fear grew, and then waiting again. The Flak 88 in the Third Reich's air defense system became a symbol of technological precision, but also of impotence against the enemy's overwhelming superiority. It was a weapon that created the illusion of protection at a time when the outcome of the air war was already decided by industrial-scale production and Allied numerical advantage. Nevertheless, its role in this confrontation remains key to understanding how Germany attempted to counter the air threat that ultimately became one of the defining factors in its defeat. The development of the 88mm gun is one of the most illustrative examples of how engineering thought adapts to the realities of a rapidly changing war. Originally conceived as a heavy anti-aircraft system, it quickly transformed into a versatile weapon capable of engaging both high-flying bombers and heavily armored tanks. But this path was not instantaneous. It consisted of numerous sequential improvements, engineering refinements, and adaptations to combat experience. Each modification of the Flak 88 was a response to a specific problem posed by the realities of aerial and ground warfare. The first versions, created in the early 1930s, represented a promising but still imperfect design. The Flak 18, which emerged as a result of circumventing Versailles restrictions, proved sufficiently effective, but its solid barrel wore out quickly. Under increasing demands for intensive firing, this feature became a serious issue. Engineers decided to switch to a sectional barrel design, divided into several parts, allowing replacement of only worn elements rather than the entire assembly. This became one of the first and most important steps toward creating a gun suitable for long and uninterrupted service on the front. Simultaneously, the carriage evolved. War demanded greater stability and precision, especially when the gun assumed an anti-tank role. Reinforced support legs, a redesigned cruciform base, and a sturdier frame turned the Flak 36, the next modification, into a gun capable of withstanding prolonged salvos without loss of accuracy. An improved transport system allowed quicker transition from march to combat position, making it suitable for maneuver warfare in the desert and positional warfare in the steppes. Parallel to this, the need grew for more technologically advanced mass production. Germany was restructuring its economy for war, and the Flak 36 was adapted to large-scale industry requirements, reducing labor-intensive parts, simplifying assembly, standardizing components. This rationalization was one of the factors that allowed the 88mm gun to become a mass-produced weapon encountered on all fronts. As the war entered a phase of total confrontation in the air, mechanical reliability alone became insufficient. This led to the birth of the Flak 37, a variant created not so much as a gun, but as an element of a complex fire control system. The technological breakthrough lay in integrating the gun with mechanical computers like the commando eject, which automatically calculated firing parameters accounting for target altitude, speed, course, and acceleration. These devices, essentially analog computers, transmitted data via cables to each battery gun, ensuring synchronization and previously unattainable accuracy. The Flak 37 became part of a unified organism. Radars provided data, command devices computed lead, cable systems relayed commands, and crews merely ensured firing tempo. Alongside the gun's design, ammunition evolved. Early serial shells were universal, but with increasing aircraft flight altitudes and task complexity, more precise solutions were needed. High-explosive fragmentation shells received new fuses with fine delay adjustment, allowing detonation at a precisely defined point in airspace. Shell casings were reworked for optimal fragment distribution, and ballistic characteristics improved for greater range and flight stability. But the revolution occurred in the anti-tank sphere. Initially, the Flak 88 was used against tanks out of necessity, but it soon became clear that with its high muzzle velocity and long barrel, it could penetrate armor considered inaccessible to other guns. Standard armor-piercing shells and later improved models like the PSGR-39 became the basis of the Flak 88's anti-tank success. Subcaliber ammunition with tungsten cores opened the possibility of engaging armor at distances unattainable for contemporary tank guns, though their quantity remained limited due to strategic metal shortages. Parallel improvements targeted aiming systems. If in tank combat the target could be seen directly, air defense required compensating for lack of visual contact with precise instruments. The commando eject was the battery's heart, a complex mechanical mechanism that in real time calculated everything needed to hit a target at altitudes over 6 kilometers. Electrical signals from the computing device to the gun moved aiming pointers, turning the battery into a single automated complex. Meanwhile, the gun's design continued to demonstrate versatility. The cruciform carriage provided full circular traverse, and the semi-automatic wedge breech allowed rapid fire even with large calibers. The sturdy barrel, designed for high pressures and long projectile travel, gave the Flak 88 that deadly muzzle velocity, which made it an indispensable tool on all fronts. Thanks to the design's versatility, it could be installed in fixed positions, used as towed artillery, placed on railway platforms, or incorporated into gigantic air defense towers in Berlin, Vienna, and Hamburg. At the same time, larger caliber guns, 105mm and 128mm, were developed, but they proved too heavy, insufficiently mobile, and less suitable for anti-tank combat. The 88mm caliber proved the optimal compromise between power, rate of fire, and mobility, explaining the gun's long service life. The history of the Flak 88's development shows that its effectiveness was not the result of a single successful engineering decision, but the outcome of constant adaptation. It changed with the war, evolving from a standard anti-aircraft gun into a universal tool capable of tasks far beyond its initial functions. It was this ability to evolve that made it one of the most recognizable and influential weapon systems of the Second World War. As the Second World War began, Germany quickly identified the limitations of its standard anti-tank weapons against Allied heavy armor. This was most evident in the early months of combat in Western Europe, and especially in Africa. Light and medium Allied tanks with armor up to 50 to 60 millimeters were relatively easily penetrated by 37 millimeter and 50 millimeter guns, but heavy machines like the French B-1 or British Matilda II proved nearly invulnerable. Germany's anti-tank artillery could not effectively handle such threats, and field commanders sought a solution to stop enemy tank columns. Thus, the 88 millimeter anti-aircraft gun was first employed on the battlefield in an anti-tank role. The use of the Flak 88 in North Africa began during the campaigns in Libya and Egypt, when Erwin Rommel's units, known for their ability to adapt quickly to situations, faced sudden counterstrikes by British tanks. Light German tanks and standard anti-tank guns were powerless against the enemy's armored vehicles. Rommel ordered the heavy anti-aircraft guns' barrels lowered to ground level to fire on advancing tanks. The results exceeded all expectations. The Flak 88, with its high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory, penetrated British tank armor at distances where the latter could not return fire. These initial operations demonstrated the gun's unique qualities: accuracy, range, and power. Guns designed for aerial targets proved exceptionally effective on the ground, and their role began to expand sharply. On the Eastern Front, the situation was different, but similar principles manifested with no less clarity. Soviet tanks at the war's start had relatively thin armor, but as the conflict progressed, heavier machines like the T-34 and KV appeared on the front. Standard German anti-tank weapons often failed against their armor. The Flak 88 once again confirmed its versatility: explosive and armor-piercing shells, high accuracy, and the ability to fire from long distances allowed engagement of new Soviet tank models, supporting German troop advances in the early years of the invasion. The gun's effectiveness depended not only on its design, but also on crew experience. On the battlefield, both professional artillerymen and young soldiers, men and women drawn into anti-aircraft units, were involved. Their training included intensive drills in aiming, loading, and maintaining fire tempo, allowing maximal use of the Flak 88. High discipline and coordinated crew actions directly influenced results, as hitting a tank or high-flying bomber required precise calculation of trajectory, speed, and lead, especially at long ranges. Military operations also showed that the Flak 88 could be used not only for direct destruction of vehicles and aerial targets, but as a tool for suppressing enemy positions. In North African conditions, guns were employed to shell infantry concentrations, fortified firing points, and enemy artillery positions, often with devastating consequences. Anti-personnel effects were achieved through high explosive fragmentation shells capable of scattering over radii of tens of meters, creating a lethal cloud for attacking forces. Thus, the Flak 88 transformed into a multifunctional weapon capable of solving multiple combat tasks. A particular role was played by the gun's mobility. Despite its impressive weight of about 7 tons, the gun could be transported on half-tracked tractors and trucks, allowing quick position changes and fire on unexpectedly appearing targets. Combined with a high rate of fire, up to 20 rounds per minute, and aiming device accuracy, this made the Flak 88 a formidable weapon for tank columns and enemy aviation. On the Eastern Front, it was even used to engage armored vehicles on distant approaches to fortified positions when other means could not provide the necessary effectiveness. As the war progressed, the Flak 88's combat capabilities continued to expand. The Germans began producing specialized armor-piercing shells like the PSGR-39 and PSGR-40, which allowed penetration of up to 100 millimeters of armor at distances up to 2 kilometers. These shells, with high kinetic energy and sturdy construction, became a serious threat to any Allied vehicle of the period. Combined with precise optics and competent crew organization, the gun turned into a near-ideal means against heavy tanks, enabling German commanders to conduct unexpected counterattacks and hold positions even under numerical enemy superiority. However, the Flak 88's versatility had a downside. Crews remained vulnerable to aviation and artillery attacks, especially when operating in open terrain. Enemy fighters and ground attack aircraft actively targeted batteries, using both direct assaults and cluster or remote bombs. Therefore, protective measures, shelters, and mobility became critically important. Despite this, the Flak 88 continued to remain one of the most effective means of defense and offense, combining the functions of a heavy anti-aircraft gun, anti-tank weapon, and tool for suppressing enemy manpower. Over time, the German army increasingly utilized this versatility. In North Africa, the guns contributed to Rommel's successes, providing reliable support to armored units, while on the Eastern Front, they enabled resistance to modernized Soviet tanks and fortified positions. Wherever the Flak 88 was employed, it combined destructive power, rapid response speed, and precise fire capability, making it an indispensable part of Germany's armed forces. Thus, the 88mm gun became a symbol of engineering versatility, embodying the concept that one weapon could perform multiple tasks, and its combat episodes in the fields of North Africa and Eastern Europe forever entered history as an example of how adapting technology to battlefield realities could radically alter the course of local engagements. As the war in Europe unfolded, Germany faced constant raids by Allied aviation. From 1942 onward, airstrikes by British and American bombers became regular, and industrial centers, transport hubs, factories, and urban quarters came under continuous threat. Standard anti-aircraft batteries and mobile Flak 88s in open terrain could no longer guarantee protection for key sites. The response to this threat was large-scale fortifications known as Flaktürme, concrete anti-aircraft towers that combined firepower, crew protection, and shelters for civilians. These structures became symbols of the Reich's urban air defense, with the Flak 88 as their central element. Flaktürme were massive concrete constructions with walls up to 3 meters thick, capable of withstanding a direct hit from a 500-kilogram aerial bomb. Each tower was designed as a self-sufficient fortress, including ammunition storage, ventilation systems, generators, water reservoirs, medical points, and food depots, as well as shelters for civilians. Inside the tower were multiple levels of armament, including 4 128mm guns and 8 88mm Flak 88s, supplemented by smaller caliber automatic guns, 20mm and 37mm, for engaging low-flying targets. Installing 88mm guns in the towers required specialized engineering. The guns were fixed on carriages with full circular traverse, and the command control system was integrated with centralized aiming devices. This allowed fire on high-flying bombers with accuracy unattainable for standard mobile batteries. Complex mechanical and electromechanical computers, including the commando juret, accounted for target speed, altitude, and direction, transmitting data to all guns in the tower. Crews, located in protected premises, could operate under dense bombardment, maintaining continuous fire and reducing error probability. The use of the Flak 88 in towers demonstrated how versatile and lethal this gun could be. In urban environments, it not only engaged aviation, but could also fire on ground targets if necessary, supporting district defense and providing protection against advancing troops. High muzzle velocity, accuracy, and rate of fire allowed effective use of the Flak 88 as a suppressive fire tool, turning the tower into a virtually impregnable point of resistance. Despite their strength and power, the number of Flaktürme remained limited. Only 8 major complexes were built around Berlin, Hamburg, and Vienna, making them strategically important but insufficient for full protection of German airspace. The Allies quickly recognized their significance and sought to bypass the towers, choosing detour routes or attacks with extreme maneuverability. Nevertheless, each tower could engage dozens of targets simultaneously, creating a dense shell cloud and forcing bombers into highly dangerous decisions upon entering the engagement zone. The Flak 88 in urban batteries and towers also proved itself as a psychological weapon. Bomber crews knew of these guns' high effectiveness and that a fragment cloud from several hundred meters could damage wings, shatter cockpits, or disable engines. Cannon fire created a visual and auditory effect that further reduced attack efficiency, forcing the Allies into maneuvers and increasing ammunition expenditure. These urban positions exemplified the combination of engineering thought and military necessity. Placing the Flak 88 in towers allowed maximal utilization of its potential, protecting critical sites and creating a threat to enemy aviation at considerable remove. The guns functioned in continuous mode, supported by computing technology, and served as a key component of Germany's defensive strategies. In combination with mobile batteries in open terrain, railway platforms, and field positions, the Flak 88 formed a branched air defense system capable of engaging targets at all altitude levels and ensuring defense of key areas. Thus, the Reich's urban air defense, built around the Flak 88, became an example of how one versatile gun could perform multiple functions, combining mobility, high firepower, accuracy, and crew protection. Operational experience showed that with competent battery organization, fire coordination, and computing support, even a limited number of guns could create an insurmountable threat to enemy aviation, and their placement in robust concrete towers ensured combat readiness under intense bombardment and raids. It was the blend of engineering versatility, thoughtful tactics, and crew preparation that made the Flak 88 the primary element of Germany's urban air defense, leaving a notable mark in the history of the Second World War. As the war progressed, the Flak 88's effectiveness faced growing challenges. The Allies, recognizing the power and versatility of this gun, began developing systematic countermeasures. Initial steps included changes in raid tactics. Bombers flew in groups, using dense formations for mutual protection and interference with aiming. Low-flying aircraft began escorting heavy bombers to suppress individual batteries with rapid fire and ground attack aviation. Large air columns necessitated more complex Flak 88 coordination, forcing German crews to rapidly switch between targets and constantly adjust firing parameters. The Allies also employed special bombs for suppressing anti-aircraft artillery. These munitions, equipped with remote fuses, were intended for disrupting battery positions and destroying crews at a safe altitude for the bomber. However, the quantity of such bombs was limited, and accurate hits required high precision. In response, the Germans strengthened their battery protections, developing both mobile and fixed positions. In open terrain, Flak 88s were placed in trenches or under camouflaged canopies, sometimes using natural cover like hills, embankments, or forests, reducing vulnerability to aviation and enemy artillery. The anti-aircraft system's effectiveness also depended on Allied countermeasures. Electronic jamming, known as jamming, began to be used to weaken the operation of radars integrated with the Flak 88 and Commando Jurat. Radar target detection became less reliable, forcing crews to use visual aiming methods and manually correct fire. Despite this, the massive firepower and accuracy of the Flak 88 preserved high engagement potential, especially with dense target concentrations or when shelling strategic sites. On the Eastern Front, the guns faced a new type of threat: well-armored Soviet equipment. The appearance of the T-34 and KV-1 forced German commanders to use the Flak 88 for long-range fire, where standard anti-tank means were powerless. High shell muzzle velocity and the ability to conduct aimed fire from distant positions made the gun practically the only countermeasure to new types of armored vehicles. Batteries equipped with Flak 88s could organize ambushes on approaches to key positions, inflicting sudden losses on enemy tank columns. In North Africa, a similar situation unfolded during Rommel's offensive and defensive operations. Here, the Flak 88's versatility manifested fully. Guns were used simultaneously for aviation suppression, armored vehicle destruction, and infantry position shelling. Mobile batteries moved on half-tracked tractors, changing positions and creating unpredictable threats for British and American troops. The tactic of preemptive fire and ambush employment allowed significant damage to the enemy even under their numerical superiority. Alongside tactical changes, the Allies developed strategic methods: night bombings, use of high-altitude bombers, so-called flying fortresses, and escort aviation reduced the effectiveness of direct Flak 88 engagements. The Germans responded with combined methods: coordination of several batteries' fire, use of various shell types, and attraction of heavy Flak 88s for firepower concentration at critical points. Each battery operated as part of a unified system, ensuring continuous crossfire, which increased hit probability and forced bombers to change course and altitude. This arms and tactics race led to the Flak 88's effectiveness gradually declining. By 1944, when the Allies began systematic bombings of German industrial centers using radio-controlled remote fuses and massive raids, the number of shots per hit increased. If at the war's start, one battery could down a bomber with a relatively small number of shots, later it took up to 16,000 shells per downing. Nevertheless, the ability to fire at long ranges and create dense fragmentation clouds remained a psychological and tactical factor, restraining enemy aviation actions. At the same time, the Allies actively analyzed the tactics and results of Flak 88 employment, developing bypass methods and loss minimization. They studied shell trajectories, fragmentation cloud density, effective engagement distances, and optimal flight altitudes. This data allowed route and flight altitude corrections, reducing hit probability and optimizing ammunition expenditure. Countering the Flak 88 became comprehensive. A combination of tactical maneuvers, air cover, and new bombing methods reduced the effect of anti-aircraft batteries, though fully neutralizing the threat was impossible under any circumstances. An important aspect remained crew preparation. With increasing raid intensity and Allies' use of tactical innovations, artilleryman training became critically important. Crews had to not only fire quickly, but constantly adapt to changing conditions, account for new target altitudes and speeds, work with electronic and visual aiming devices. Each error could cost the crew's lives and delay the destruction of a bomber or tank. This is why German Flak 88 batteries were considered among the most demanding in terms of preparation and discipline levels. Thus, the Flak 88 in the Reich's air defense continued to remain a formidable force despite growing complexities. The gun's versatility, high shell speed, accuracy, and long-range fire capability made it a threat to aviation and armored vehicles, while constant tactic improvement and adaptation to new conditions allowed preservation of its effectiveness even in the war's late stages. This evolution showed that the 88mm gun was not just an artillery piece, but an entire complex of military engineering thought, adapted to real combat conditions, capable of altering the course of local battles and remaining a significant factor on the battlefield. The development of the Flak 88 was not a static process. Throughout its operational period, German engineers and military command strove to adapt the gun to new challenges. When the Flak 88 first appeared as an anti-aircraft gun in the late 1930s, its design was already considered advanced. A long barrel, high muzzle velocity, powerful ammunition, and a well-thought-out carriage system. However, the war quickly showed that the gun's potential was immense and far from exhausted. Therefore, each modification aimed to increase accuracy, range, crew survivability, and maintenance convenience. The first significant changes were the modernizations of the Flak 18, leading to the Flak 36, and later, the Flak 37. These designations did not imply a complete design change, but reflected important refinements. The Flak 18 used a complex cast carriage that proved labor-intensive in production and difficult to maintain. Switching to a simpler stamped carriage in the Flak 36 model significantly accelerated production and eased part replacement. Additionally, the barrel casing was improved, allowing quicker replacement of damaged elements and maintaining the barrel in operational condition during intensive firing. The third major version, the Flak 37, received an enhanced aiming system integrated with command instrument posts. This allowed synchronization of multiple batteries and increased firing accuracy at long ranges. The Flak 37 was designed for combat where the target is high, fast-moving, and requires complex trajectory calculations. Thanks to improved commando Gerät devices, target data was transmitted directly to the guns, eliminating delay and enhancing accuracy against heavy bombers. Parallel to this was the adaptation of the gun to an anti-tank role. Although originally not intended for armored vehicle combat, its characteristics made this variant logical. The Germans began producing specialized armor-piercing shells, increasing penetration capability. The initial PZGR-39s possessed excellent kinetic energy and could engage most Allied tanks at distances up to 2 kilometers. Later, shells with tungsten cores, the PZGR-40, provided even greater penetration, though their production was limited due to strategic material shortages. Despite the design's complexity and high resource demands, Germany continued Flak 88 production at several factories, including Krupp concern enterprises. The production chain included milling long barrels, manufacturing carriages, assembling aiming mechanisms, and testing barrels at special sites. Due to high manufacturing precision, each gun required significant time and skilled labor. This made it expensive and complex for mass production, but the effectiveness it provided on the front was sufficient to offset the costs. At war's end, the Flak 41 was developed, an improved version with a longer barrel, higher muzzle velocity, and enhanced engagement range. It was intended to counter Allied high-altitude bombers capable of flying above 10 kilometers. However, this model proved too complex for mass production. Requirements for metal, equipment, and assembly time were so high that Flak 41 output remained limited, and most crews continued using the proven Flak 36 and Flak 37. The Flak 88's evolution also affected transportation and mounting methods. Initially, the gun was transported on a four-wheeled Sonderanhänger 201 carriage, which allowed quick transition to combat position. Later, improved transport variants on half-track tractors were developed, especially for Eastern Front conditions, where cross-country capability was key. These tractors provided battery maneuverability and allowed guns to change positions without giving the enemy aimed return fire. Flak 88 production in the war's final years reflected the general state of German industry. Constant Allied bombings, material shortages, factory destruction, and loss of skilled workers led to output reduction. Despite this, production continued until the war's last months, and earlier produced guns remained actively used on all fronts until Germany's capitulation. High reliability allowed the Flak 88 to stay in service, even with spare part shortages. Many crews manually repaired damaged elements using improvised materials to maintain combat readiness. The Flak 88's technical improvements and modifications demonstrated Germany's constant striving to enhance weapon effectiveness, adapt it to new tasks and conditions. Each gun version represented a step forward in engineering thought, even if production faced difficulties. It was thanks to these improvements that the Flak 88 became a versatile weapon used both as an anti-aircraft system and anti-tank means, and as a tool for suppressing fortified positions. This evolution transformed the Flak 88 into one of the most recognizable and effective guns of the Second World War, leaving a deep mark in military history through the combination of technical power and ability to adapt to constantly changing war conditions. By the end of the Second World War, the Flak 88 remained one of the most versatile and formidable guns created by Germany. Its unique characteristics, high muzzle velocity, accuracy, range, and adaptability to various combat tasks, made it a symbol of engineering versatility and an example of how technical thought can transform the course of battles. However, the gun's effectiveness was not determined solely by its design. The Flak 88's viability directly depended on crew professionalism, battery organizational structure, and integration with command and fire control systems. In practical application, the Flak 88 proved its multitasking capability. On the North African front, it was successfully used against heavy armored vehicles when standard anti-tank guns were powerless. High accuracy and flat shell trajectories allowed tank engagements at ranges where the enemy could not return fire. On the Eastern Front, the gun was indispensable when confronting modernized Soviet tanks, enabling German units to hold positions and conduct counterstrikes. Parallel to this, its air defense role remained key, especially in protecting strategic sites, cities, and industrial centers. Urban anti-aircraft towers and fortified positions with Flak 88s represented a combination of engineering thought and military necessity. These massive structures provided civilian protection, created dense fire networks against enemy aviation, and supported defense of key areas. Combined with mobile batteries in open terrain that could quickly change positions, the Flak 88 formed a complex air defense system capable of engaging targets at all altitude levels. Multi-layered fire organization, integration with centralized computing systems, and dense battery concentration increased effectiveness and made the gun a threat to enemy aviation over tens of kilometers. However, the Flak 88's unique effectiveness had a downside. crews remained vulnerable to aviation, artillery, and ground troop actions. Losses among crews were high, especially in the war's later years when the Allies employed massive bombings, assault attacks, and remotely controlled munitions. In some cases, up to 70% of crews were lost during active raids. Nevertheless, the gun continued to perform its functions, and the combination of engineering power, mobility, and versatility allowed preservation of strategic significance even in critical conditions. Production aspects also influenced the Flak 88's history. High manufacturing precision, mechanical part complexity, and material demands made production costly and labor-intensive. With war expansion and worsening industrial situation, Flak 88 output faced difficulties, but engineers and factories, despite bombings and material shortages, continued production. This allowed front supply with new guns, maintenance of battery combat readiness, and modernization. The appearance of Flak 36, Flak 37, and in limited quantities Flak 41 reflected constant striving to improve gun effectiveness. The Flak 88 left a deep mark in military technology and tactics history. It demonstrated that one gun could be simultaneously anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and a tool for suppressing enemy manpower, while competent fire organization, crew training, and computing system integration could radically alter battlefield effectiveness. Versatility, accuracy, and lethal power made the Flak 88 a symbol of German engineering thought in the Second World War, and its combat experience continues to be studied by historians and military engineers as an example of how technology can transform battle outcomes. The Flak 88's legacy extends beyond specific battles. It became a benchmark for combining high engineering precision, application versatility, and adaptability to rapidly changing tactical environments. Its operational experience showed the importance of a comprehensive approach, not just the gun itself, but organization, crew preparation, fire control systems, and mobility. All these elements together create an effective combat means. The Flak 88 became an example of how engineering thought and practical experience interact on the battlefield, creating a weapon capable of multiple functions and remaining significant even under radically changed war conditions. Its employment in North Africa, on the Eastern Front, and in city defense confirmed its versatility. Guns engaged tanks, aircraft, fortifications, and enemy manpower, making them one of the most dangerous and multifunctional weapons of the Second World War. Engineering solutions, including data transmission systems for synchronizing multiple batteries and advanced mechanical computers, allowed precise long-range fire while reducing miss probability. Even under growing Allied countermeasures, the Flak 88 remained a formidable weapon capable of inflicting significant damage and creating psychological pressure on the enemy. Thus, the Flak 88 became not just an artillery piece, but a symbol of engineering versatility and combat effectiveness. It demonstrated how one technical solution can transform, adapt to new conditions, and perform multiple combat tasks simultaneously. Losses among crews, production difficulties, and constant improvements, all this formed an integral part of its history. The Flak 88 left an indelible mark in military history as a weapon that changed approaches to air defense, anti-tank combat, and engineering organization of fire systems, confirming that technical sophistication and tactical adaptation can shape success on the battlefield.